if y'all can see that. You know why my camera's not focusing. Chapter 2. Continuation of the principles relative to the nature of man, of will and liberty. It was not sufficient, pursuant to the views of the Creator, that the human soul should be possessed of the faculty of knowing things, and of forming therefore ideas. It was likewise requisite it should be endowed with an active principle to set it in motion, and with a power whereby man, after knowing the objects that occurred to him, should be capable of determining to act or not to act, according as he judges proper. This faculty is what we call the will. The will, therefore, nothing else but the power of the soul, by which it is determined of itself, and by virtue of an active principle inherent in its nature, to seek for what is agreeable to it, to act after a certain manner, and to do or to admit an action, with a view of happiness. By happiness, we are to understand the internal satisfaction of the soul arising from the possession of good and by good. Whatever is suitable or agreeable to man is for his preservation, perfection, convenience, or pleasure. The idea of good determines that of evil, which, in its most general signification, implies whatever is opposite to the preservation, perfection, convenience, or pleasure of man. Instincts, inclinations, and passions are reducible to the will. Instincts are sentiments exact in the soul. Instincts are sentiments excited in the soul by the wants of the body, which determine to provide immediately against them. Such are hunger, thirst, the aversion for whatever is hurtful. The inclinations are a propensity of the will, which leads it rather towards some sorts of objects than others, but in an even tranquil manner, a manner so proportioned to all its operations that instead of obstructing or interrupting, it generally facilitates them. As for the passions, they are indeed in the same manner as the inclinations, motions of the will towards certain objects, but motions of a more impetuous and turbulent kind, motions that dispossess the soul of a natural tranquility and hinder it from directing properly its operations. Then it is that the passions become one of the most dangerous distempers of man. The cause of passion is generally the allurement of some sensible good which solicits the soul and impels it with too violent an impression. 'Tis easy to conceive, by what has been here said, that the inclinations, passions, and instincts have a very great affinity with one another. They are all alike propensities or motions, which have frequently the same objects. But there is a difference between these, that instincts are necessarily the same in all men by a natural consequence of their constitution and of the union between the body and soul, whereas the inclinations and passions particularly considered have nothing necessarily in their nature, and are surprisingly different in different men. Let us make an observation here, which falls in very naturally. 'Tis that we often give the name of heart to the will, considered as susceptible of the aforementioned motions, and the reason of this, in all probability, is because these motions are supposed to have their feet in the heart. Such is the nature of the soul, and that the will not only acts always spontaneously, that is, by its own proper motion, of its own accord, and by an internal principle, but likewise that its determinations are generally accompanied with liberty. We give the name of liberty to that force of power of the soul whereby it modifies and regulates its operations as it pleases, so as to be able to suspend, continue, or alter its deliberations and actions. In a word, so as to be capable to determine and act with choice according as it thinks proper. 'Tis by this excellent faculty that man has a kind of command over himself and his actions, and as he is hereby rendered also capable of conforming to rule and answerable to his conduct. It is thereby necessary to give a further explanation of the nature of his faculty. Will and liberty being faculties of the soul, they cannot be blind or destitute of knowledge. But necessarily suppose the operation of the understanding. How is it possible, in fact, to determine, suspend, or alter our resolutions unless we know what is proper for us to choose? It is contrary to the nature of an intelligent and rational being to act without intellection and reason. This reason may be either superficial or bad, yet it has some appearance, at least some glimmering, that makes us give it a momentary approbation wherever there is election or choice. There must be a comparison, and a comparison implies at least a confused reflection, a kind of deliberation, though of a quick and almost imperceptible nature, of the subject before us. The end of our deliberations is to procure us some advantage, for the will tends generally towards good, that is, to whatsoever is really or apparently proper for rendering us happy, insomuch that all actions depending on man that are any way relative to his end are for this very reason subject to the will. And as truth or the knowledge of things is agreeable to men, and in this signification truth is also a good, it follows therefore that truth forms one of its principal objects of the will. Liberty, like the will, has goodness and truth for its object, but it has less extent with regard to actions, for it does not exercise itself in all the acts of the will, but only those which the soul has a power of suspending or altering as it pleases. But if anyone should inquire which are those actions wherein liberty dispels itself, we answer that they are easily known by attending what passes within us to the manner in which the mind conducts itself in several cases that daily occur. As in the first place, in our judgments concerning true or false. Secondly, in our determinations in relation to good and evil. And finally, in indifferent matters. These particulars are necessary in order to be acquainted with the nature, use, and extent of liberty. With regard to truth, we are formed in such a manner that as soon as evidence strikes the mind, we are no longer at liberty to suspend our judgment. Vain would be the attempt to resist this sparkling light. It absolutely forces our assent. Who, for example, could pretend to to deny that the whole is greater than the part, or that harmony and peace are preferable either in a family or state to discord, tumults, and war. The same cannot be affirmed in regard to things that have less perspicuity and evidence, for in these the use of liberty dispels itself in its full extent. 'Tis true, our mind inclines naturally to the side which seems the most probable, but this does not debar from suspending its assent in order to seek out new proofs, or to refer the whole inquiry to another opportunity. The obscurer things are, the more we are at liberty to hesitate, to suspend, or defer our determinations. This is a point sufficiently evidenced by experience. Every day and at every step, as it were, disputes arise, in which the arguments on both sides leave us by reason of our limited capacity in a kind of doubt and equilibrium, which permits us to suspend our judgment, to examine the things anew, and to incline the balance at length to one side more than the other. We find, for example, that the mind can hesitate a long time and forbear determination itself, even after a mature inquiry, in respect to the following questions: whether an oath extorted by violence is obligatory, whether the murder of Caesar was lawful, whether the Roman Senate could with justice refuse to confirm the promise made by the consuls to the Samnites in order to extract themselves from the Chaldean forks, or whether they ought to have ratified and given the force of a public treaty. Though there is no exercise of liberty in our judgments when things present themselves to us in a clear and distinct manner, still we must not imagine that the entire use of the faculty ceases in respect to things that are evident. For in the first place, it is always in our power to apply our minds to the consideration of things, or else to divert them from thence by transferring somewhere else our attention. This first determination of will, by which it is led to consider or not to consider the objects that occur to us, merits particular notice because of the natural influence in which must have on the very determination by which we conclude to act or not to act, and consequence our thoughts and judgments. Secondly, we have it likewise in our power to create, as it were, evidence in some cases by dint of attention and inquiry, whereas at first setting out we had only some glimmerings insufficient to give us an adequate knowledge of the state of things. And time, when we have attained this evidence, we are still at liberty to dwell more or less on the consideration thereof, which is also of great consequence. Because of this depends its greater or lesser degree of impression. These remarks lead us to an important reflection, which may serve for answer to an objection ratified against liberty. It is not in our power to perceive things otherwise than as they offer themselves to our mind. Now our judgments are formed on this perception, and it is by these judgments that the will is determined. The whole is therefore necessary and independent of liberty. And this difficulty carries little more with it than an empty appearance. Let people say what they will, we are always at liberty to open or to shut our eyes to the light, to sustain or relax our attention. Experience shows that when we view an object in different lights and determine to search into the bottom of matters, we decree several things. We decree several things that escape us at first sight. This that this is sufficient to prove that there is an exercise of liberty and the operations of understanding, and as well and several actions therefore thereon depending. The second question we have to examine whether we are equally free of our determinations in regard to good and evil. To decide this point, we need not stir out ourselves, for here also, by facts and even by our internal experience, the question may be determined. Certain it is that in respect to good and evil considered in general, inasmuch we cannot properly speaking exercise our liberty by reason that we feel ourselves drawn towards the one by invincible propensity and estranged from the other by a natural insufferable aversion. Thus it has been ordered by the author of our being, whilst man has no power in this respect to change his nature, we are formed in such a manner that good of necessity allures us, whereas evil by an opposite effect repels us, as it were, and determines us from attempting to pursue it. But this strong tendency to good and natural aversion to evil in general does not debar us from being perfectly free in respect to good and evil particularly considered. And though we cannot help being sensible to the first impressions which the objects make on us, yet this does not invincibly determine us to pursue or shun those objects. Let the most beautiful and most fragrant fruit, resplendent with exquisite and delicious juice, be unexpectedly set before a person oppressed with thirst and heat. He will find himself instantly inclined to seize on the blessing that is before him and to ease his inquietude by a salutary refreshment. But he can also stop and suspend his action in order to examine whether the good he proposes to himself by eating this fruit will not be attended with evil. In short, he is at liberty to weigh and deliberate in order to embrace this the safest side of the question. Besides, we are not only capable, with the assistance of reason, to deprive ourselves of a thing whose flattering idea invites us, but moreover, we are able to expose ourselves to a chagrin or pain which we dread and would willingly avoid, were we not induced by superior considerations to support it. Can anyone desire a stronger proof of liberty? True, it is notwithstanding that the exercise of this faculty never displays itself more than in different things. I find, for instance, that it depends entirely on myself to stretch out or draw back my hand, to sit down or to walk, to direct my steps to the right or left. On these occasions, where the soul is left entirely to itself, either for want of external motives or by reason of opposition, and as it were the equilibrium of these motives, if it determines one side, this may be said to be the pure effect of its pleasure with goodwill and of the command it has over its own actions. Let us stop here a while to inquire how comes it that the exercise of this power is limited to particular goods and non-evident truths without extending itself to good in general, or to such truths as perfectly clear. Should we happen to discover the reason, therefore, it will furnish us with a new subject to admire the wisdom of the Creator in the constitution of man, and with a means at the same time of being better acquainted with the end and true use of liberty. And first, we hope, there is nobody but will admit that the end of God in creating man was to render him happy. Upon this supposition, it will be soon agreed that man cannot attain happiness any other way than by the knowledge of truth, by the possession of real good. This is evidently the result of the notions above given of good and happiness. Let us therefore direct our reflections towards this prospect. When things are the objects of our researches, present themselves to our minds with a feeble light, and are not accompanied with the splendor of clearness, which enables us to know them perfectly and to judge them with full certainty, it is proper and even necessary for us to be invested with a power of suspending our judgment to the end, and not being necessarily determined to acquiesce to the first impressions. We should be still at liberty to carry on our inquiry till we arrive to a higher degree of certainty, and if possible, as far as evidence itself. Were not this the case, we should be exposed every moment to error, without any possibility of being undeceived. It was therefore extremely useful and necessary to man that under such circumstances he should have the use and exercise of his liberty. But when we happen to have a clear and distinct view of things and their relations, that is, when evidence strikes us, it would be of no matter of the signification to have the use of liberty in order to suspend our judgments. For certainty being then in its highest degree, what benefit should we reap by a new examine or inquiry were in our power? We have no longer occasion to consult a guide when we see distinctly the end we are attending to and the road we are to take. 'Tis therefore an advantage to man to be unable to refuse his assent to evidence. Let us reason pretty near in the same manner on the use of liberty in respect to good and evil. Man designed for happiness should certainly have been formed in such a manner as to find himself under an absolute necessity of desiring and pursuing good, and of shunning, on the contrary, evil in general, were the nature of these faculties such as to leave him in a state of indifference, so as to be at liberty in this respect to suspend or alter his desires. Plain it is that this would be esteemed a very great imperfection to him, an imperfection that would imply a want of wisdom in the author of his being, as a thing directly opposite to the end he proposed in giving him life. No less an inconveniency would it be, on the other hand, where the necessity which man is under pursuing good and avoiding evil to be such as would insufferably determine him to act or not to act, in consequence of the impressions made on him by each object. Such is the state of human things, that we are subsequently deceived by appearances. 'Tis very rare that good or evil presents itself to us pure and without mixture. But there is also always a favorable and adverse side, an inconveniency mixed with utility, in order to act therefore with safety, and not to be mistaken in our account. And it's generally incumbent upon us to suspend our first motions, to examine more closely into things, to make distinctions, calculations, and compensations, all all which requires the use of liberty. Liberty is therefore, as it were, a subsidiary faculty which supplies. Hang on just a second.